The call came in just after midnight during the deepest part of winter, the stretch locals call the dead dark, when the sun doesn't rise at all and time starts to lose its meaning. I was working the late shift at a remote fuel depot outside Nome, a lonely gas station sitting where the road thins out and becomes nothing but ice, tundra, and wind, and the kind of place that only sees hunters, truckers, and people who don't have many other options. The station lights buzzed constantly, fluorescent tubes humming above the pumps while frost crawled along the glass of the office windows, and outside the darkness pressed so close it felt like the world ended just beyond the reach of the light. That night the temperature had dropped below -40, the kind of cold where even breathing hurts and engines whine like wounded animals before giving up completely. I was counting cash behind the counter when the bell over the door rang, sharp and loud in the quiet, and a man stepped inside wrapped in a heavy parka with the hood pulled so far forward I couldn't see his face. Snow clung to his boots and dripped onto the floor, but there was something strange about how little of it melted, as if the cold followed him inside. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, shoulders rising and falling slowly, staring at the coffee machine like he was trying to remember what it was used for. I waited a moment, then asked if he needed fuel or food, my voice sounding too loud in the room. When he finally spoke, his words came out soft and flat, almost rehearsed, and he asked me what time it was. I told him it was 12:47. He nodded as if that confirmed something important, then asked how far it was to the next town. When I told him it was nearly 60 miles, and that the road wasn't plowed tonight because of the cold, his head tilted slightly like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. That was when I noticed his gloves. They were soaked dark, not with snow, but with something that had frozen stiff and glossy. And when he rested one hand on the counter, I saw thin cracks spreading through the ice coating his sleeve, as though what was inside was warmer than it should have been. Before I could ask anything else, the station lights flickered once, twice, and the man suddenly looked up, snapping his head toward the windows with a sharp movement that felt wrong, too fast for someone bundled in heavy gear. Outside, near Pump 3, a second shape stood just beyond the edge of the light, tall and thin, unmoving despite the wind that bent the trees along the road. The man's breathing grew louder. He leaned closer to the counter and said I shouldn't acknowledge the other one, that it only knows you're there if you let the lights touch it. His voice trembled now, urgency bleeding through the calm, and he asked if I had somewhere warm he could hide for a few minutes. Before I could answer, the bell rang again even though the door never opened. The sound echoed through the station, wrong and distorted, and outside, the tall shape took one slow step forward into the light. The temperature inside dropped so suddenly my breath fogged the air, and frost bloomed across the coffee pot in seconds. The man cursed under his breath and backed toward the restroom, whispering that whatever was out there followed broken vehicles and lonely lights, that it wore faces it found along the road, and that you never helped it unless you wanted to disappear with the snow when spring came. A heavy knock landed on the glass, once, deliberate and controlled, right at eye level. I froze behind the counter as a second knock followed, slower this time, and then a third, each one sending vibrations through the floor. The man shook his head violently, pressing a hand over his mouth to keep from speaking, while outside the silhouette leaned closer to the window, its outline blurring and shifting like smoke trapped in human shape. The lights flickered again, and this time the pump shut off entirely, plunging half the forecourt into darkness. The shape outside grew clearer in the remaining light, and I could swear its face looked almost normal, almost familiar, like someone I might have waved at earlier that evening without thinking twice. The knocking moved to the door. 3 slow taps. Then a pause. Then a voice called my name, using my exact tone, asking me to open up because it was freezing out there and something had followed it through the trees. The man bolted for the restroom, slamming the door behind him, and I did the only thing that felt right in that moment. I killed the main breaker, plunging the station into complete darkness, and dropped to the floor behind the counter as silence swallowed everything. For several minutes, nothing happened. No knocking, no voice, just the faint wind outside and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I finally dared to turn the lights back on, the forecourt was empty. No footprints, no figure, no man in the restroom either, only wet boot prints that stopped in the middle of the floor like he'd stepped out of the world entirely. I quit that job a week later and moved inland, far from any highways or stations that stayed open all night. But sometimes, when winter stretches long and the darkness presses close, my phone will light up at 12:47 exactly, displaying my own name as the caller. And when I answer, all I hear is breathing and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing in the cold. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The ice road only exists a few months each year, carved across frozen rivers and lakes thick enough to carry trucks loaded with fuel. But everyone who drives it knows there's a narrow window where the ice remembers what it used to be and hasn't decided what it wants to become yet. I was hauling supplies north in the early morning hours, an empty sky hanging low and colorless, when the radio traffic suddenly thinned out and then stopped altogether, leaving nothing but the low growl of my engine and the constant whine of studs biting into ice beneath the tires. The thermometer on the dash read -38, cold enough that metal complains and plastic snaps if you move it wrong. About 20 miles out from the last checkpoint, my headlights caught a vehicle ahead, parked at an angle across the road, hazard lights blinking weakly like someone struggling to stay awake. I slowed immediately, heart tightening, because nobody stops on the ice road unless something is already wrong. The truck was a government-marked utility vehicle, engine dead, driver's side door open, and frost had climbed halfway up the interior, sealing the dashboard in white. There were footprints in the snow leading away from it, deep and hurried, heading straight out onto the lake beside the road where there shouldn't have been any reason to go. I radioed dispatch, but the call came back garbled, my own voice echoing in slurred fragments before vanishing into static. Against better judgment, I parked and stepped out, the cold snapping instantly at my lungs as the wind pressed flat against the surface of the ice. The footprints continued away from the truck for maybe 40 yards before they stopped abruptly, ending in a wide scuffed patch where the snow was churned and cracked, the ice beneath spiderwebbed, as if something heavy had been dragged there and then removed vertically rather than pulled away. That was when I felt it under my boots, a low vibration traveling up through the ice, subtle but rhythmic, like distant machinery or massive breathing carried through stone. A warning alarm in my head screamed to get back in the cab, but curiosity and concern have a way of overriding better instincts in places where there aren't many people left to help. Another set of lights appeared on the horizon behind me, growing steadily larger, and through my windshield I saw a convoy truck approaching at speed, its headlights flaring as it swerved suddenly, nearly jackknifing before coming to a halt 100 yards back. The driver jumped out, shouting over the wind that he'd been following strange signals on his radio for the last 10 minutes. Fragments of voices warning him to slow down, saying the road wasn't solid ahead, even though the mapped ice thickness said otherwise. As we stood there, arguing about whether to turn back or bypass the stopped truck, the vibration beneath us deepened into a sound you don't forget once you hear it. A loud, tearing groan as the ice shifted beneath its own weight. The road flexed visibly, cracks crawling like lightning beneath the surface, spreading outward in long, branching lines. We ran for our vehicles as the frozen lake answered back, a booming noise rising from below, and in the chaos I caught a glimpse through clear ice of shapes moving far beneath us, darker than the surrounding water, drifting upward with disturbing patience. as if they'd felt the warmth of engines and were responding. The stopped utility truck slid sideways as the ice fractured under its weight, sinking nose first without splashing, vanishing so cleanly it looked rehearsed. From the hole it left behind came a rush of icy air that reeked of rot and old metal. And beneath that smell was something else, something alive. The convoy driver screamed that something had grabbed his axle, and for a split second before he slammed the door shut, I saw long pale forms flicker just beneath the surface, pressing against the ice from below, tracing the road's outline exactly, following the warmth and vibration like predators tracking prey by sound. I gunned my engine and didn't stop until my tires hit solid ground miles later, my radio crackling again only once I crossed off the lake, bursting to life with emergency warnings about unstable ice and missing vehicles that had never checked in. Days later, officials blamed thinning ice and improper load distribution for the loss, but no one could explain why sonar sweeps showed repeated vertical scrapes along the lake bed directly beneath the ice road, or why every truck that passed that stretch after midnight reported feeling something tap the underside of their chassis exactly 3 times before the road finally closed for the season. Still, when winter comes and the ice thickens again, pilot lights flare back to life across the lakes, and drivers line up to test the crossing once more. Because in Alaska, the road always calls you back, no matter what waits beneath it. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The village sat along the edge of a frozen bay so wide it swallowed sound. A place where winter turned the ocean into white stone and the sky into an unblinking lid that didn't lift for months at a time. And I arrived there as part of a temporary maintenance crew, just as polar night settled in fully, when the sun stopped rising altogether and people began measuring time by meals instead of daylight. From the moment we flew in, something felt off about the place. Not hostile, not openly threatening, just watchful, like we had stepped into a pause rather than a location. Houses huddled close together near the shoreline, their windows glowing warmly against the dark, while further out onto the ice stood tall wooden poles topped with heavy lamps that burned all night, spaced evenly in a long line stretching across the frozen bay. I asked one of the locals what the lights were for, assuming they marked a snowmobile route or a safe corridor for fishing, but he hesitated before answering, eyes flicking instinctively toward the ice, and finally said they were there so people didn't wander too far when the dark pressed in. He didn't say safe, not once. On our 3rd night, while the rest of the crew slept, I stood near the window of the bunkhouse watching the lamps tremble softly in the wind, their glow reflecting faintly beneath the ice like a second sky trapped below the surface. And that's when I noticed gaps in the reflections, patches of darkness that moved slowly between the glows, passing from one light's shadow into the next, too deliberate to belong to shifting ice or tides. The radio sitting on the table clicked once, then again, before coming alive with a burst of static. And through it came a voice speaking in slow, careful English, asking if anyone could see the lights clearly tonight, because the water was restless. The voice wasn't unfamiliar, but it didn't belong to anyone I knew. And when I asked dispatch to identify the transmission, the radio returned only my own words, delayed and slightly distorted, as though the bay were listening and learning how I sounded. At dinner the next evening, our host quietly told us not to go out onto the ice after midnight, not even between the lamps, and when someone laughed it off, he looked genuinely uncomfortable and said the lights were never meant to guide people away from the village, only to show something else where the land ended. That night, a storm rolled in low and heavy, snow drifting sideways across the ice, and somewhere after midnight the power flickered, dimming the bunkhouse lights for just a second. When they steadied again, one of the bay lamps had gone dark. Almost immediately another followed. They didn't fail randomly. Each extinguished in sequence, moving farther from shore. The darkness advancing inward, one pool of shadow at a time, and beneath the wind, I heard a deep, resonant sound. Something between shifting ice and breath moving through enormous lungs. The radio exploded with overlapping transmissions, fragments of voices layered on top of each other, some pleading, some calm, some speaking names I recognized from the village, all repeating the same phrase in different tones. The line is breaking. Against every instruction, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside with 2 other crew members, the cold biting instantly through fabric as the dark towered above us. And as we reached the shoreline, I realized that beneath each remaining bay light, the ice shimmered unnaturally, flexing slightly as though the water below was pressing up in patient tests rather than violent strikes. One of the villagers shouted for us to come back just as the nearest lamp flickered violently, its pole shaking, and when the light finally went out, I saw something vast pass beneath the ice, displacing the glow of everything around it, a darkness deeper than the bay itself moving toward the shore. The ice groaned, long fractures spidering outward from beneath the remaining lamps, and in that moment I understood what the lights were really for. Not to protect us from the bay, but to keep whatever was beneath it oriented, calm, and satisfied. The villagers rang an old bell from the highest point of the village, its sound carrying clearly through the storm. And slowly, reluctantly, the dark beneath the ice retreated, drifting back toward the deepest part of the bay, leaving the remaining lights trembling but intact. By morning, every lamp still stood, though one was badly bent, and no one spoke about the night except to say we were lucky the line hadn't broken completely. When I asked what would have happened if it had, our host simply said there were older villages further down the coast that no longer used bay lights at all, and no longer existed either. I left as soon as the weather allowed, but even now, whenever I see rows of light stretching across dark water or frozen ground, I feel a pressure behind my eyes, a certainty that something beneath the surface is counting them carefully, waiting for enough darkness to know it's time to move. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The wind had already erased most of the tracks by the time the bush plane landed, skis hissing over packed snow before settling beside a half-buried cabin that looked more like a forgotten tool shed than a place anyone still used. And I remember thinking as the engine cut that this was the kind of spot pilots mark on maps, only because someone once failed to come back from it. I was there to check a radio relay station that serviced a string of remote hunting cabins scattered across the interior, places that only came alive a few weeks a year when people convinced themselves they could handle the silence. But the automated alert that went out earlier that day wasn't technical. It wasn't a power drop or interference warning. It was a recorded voice repeating the same phrase every 30 minutes, broadcast on every channel the relay touched. I can see the lights from up here. The pilot refused to stay, wouldn't even shut down fully, just kept the engine idling while unloading my gear, eyes scanning the trees like he expected them to move. And before taking off, he told me not to use the exterior work lights if night fell, because things notice changes out here. Not shapes, not sounds, but sudden differences where none should exist. The sun was already dragging itself toward the horizon when I reached the cabin, and although the sky still held color, the cold had that metallic edge that crawls into tools and joints alike. The radio inside sat on a shelf beneath frost-lined windows, its power indicator glowing steadily, even though the generator outside hadn't been started yet. I powered the system down completely, breakers thrown, batteries disconnected, and still the radio whispered faintly, not words, just static broken by a distant rhythm like breathing slowed by weather. And when I leaned close, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the speaker at all, but from the metal casing itself. vibrating subtly as if something beneath the frequency of hearing was pushing outward. Night came fast. Not gradually, not gently, but like someone flipping a switch, plunging the cabin into a moonless blackness where the world beyond the walls simply stopped existing. And instinctively I reached for the exterior floodlight mounted above the door, thumb hovering over the switch before I remembered the pilot's warning. I didn't turn it on. Instead, I lit a single lantern and set it near the window, its warm glow barely touching the tree line outside. And almost immediately I saw a movement, distant at first, shadows sliding between trunks where no wind blew, drifting closer without urgency, like they knew time wasn't limited. The radio snapped alive. Clear this time. A man's voice came through, calm, conversational, saying my name with the sound of someone smiling while they spoke, and then adding, "You see us now, right?" As if the answer were obvious and unavoidable. I grabbed the handheld and demanded identification, code words, anything. But the response came delayed and warped, my own voice echoing back at me before the man spoke again, explaining patiently that the relay didn't just pass signals, it mattered where you stood when you listened, because lights functioned differently up here during the long night and sometimes acted like invitations rather than warnings. Outside, the lantern flickered. Beyond the glass, the tree line had changed. The trees stood closer now, branches angled inward, and between them I could see pale shapes reflecting faintly, not eyes exactly, but flat surfaces that caught light the way ice does when it hasn't broken yet. Something touched the cabin wall. Not a strike, not a knock, just pressure, steady and deliberate, like a hand testing how solid the structure really was. And when it moved along the wall toward the lantern-lit window, frost bloomed across the glass in branching patterns that distorted whatever pressed behind it. The radio voice softened, almost kind, explaining that the lights didn't belong to me anymore, that once they found you useful, it was polite to share, and that if I stepped outside, they would guide me somewhere warmer where the dark couldn't reach. The lantern guttered again. This time I snuffed it out completely. The darkness inside the cabin became absolute, but so did the silence, sudden and total. And for several heartbeats nothing happened, until I realized the pressure on the walls had stopped, and the forest soundlessly withdrew. At dawn, the pilot returned pale and shaking, asking why the relay logs showed 3 new transmitters active through the night, all broadcasting from my location, all repeating the same message until sunrise. I can see the lights from up here. We left without checking the cabin again. Weeks later, long after repairs were supposedly complete, another request came in from the same region, triggered by a new voice on the frequency, one that wasn't mine but used my speech pattern perfectly, calmly telling anyone listening that the lights were beautiful tonight and that I had finally learned where to stand to see them properly. I don't work remote sites anymore, but when winter settles in and the power flickers, I still avoid looking out the window at night, because sometimes the dark beyond the glass feels crowded, and I know better now than to let whatever is waiting see me notice the glow. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The first thing you learn living in rural Alaska is that the sky is louder than the ground. Storms don't just blow in. They roar over the tundra like a freight train. And on the night everything went wrong, I was sitting in the tiny EMS station in Kuskatak, listening to the building creak under 50-mile winds while the aurora snapped and twisted green through the gaps in the clouds. I was halfway through a stale cup of coffee when the radio cracked with a burst of static so sharp it made the lights flicker. And then Chief Dana's voice came through, thin and warped, saying my name over and over like the record was skipping. Evan, pick up. We got a call from mile 42 cabin. Hunter down, possible exposure. Family phone line is trash. You're the only medic on tonight. And before I could answer, The transmission dragged into this long, rising whistle that sounded nothing like her, more like wind blowing across the mouth of a bottle, until the speaker popped and the room went quiet again. Mile 42 wasn't really a place. It was just what locals called a cluster of old trapper cabins off the road that runs parallel to the frozen river, a good 40 minutes from town on a clear night. And nobody with sense tried to get out there in a blizzard, but the land doesn't care what makes sense, and neither do emergencies. So I grabbed the trauma bag, the orange hypothermia kit, and the satellite radio, then headed for the Snowcat while the dispatcher tried to get Dana back on Channel 1. The wind hit me hard enough to make my eyes water even through my balaclava, fine ice crystals stinging every bit of skin they could find. The sky overhead flickered with a dull green smear of aurora behind the clouds, just bright enough to make the snow glow a sick pale color, and for a second as I climbed into the Snowcat, it felt like the air hummed around me, like a transformer about to blow, though there was nothing out there but the frozen parking lot and the dark shape of the school. The drive out to mile 42 felt wrong from the start. I've done that road 100 times, and even in a whiteout your body remembers its curves, but the headlights were chewing up the snow in strange ways, throwing long, crooked shadows from the spruce trees that seemed to bend toward the road, and my GPS kept losing its signal, blinking from my position to a random spot miles out on the frozen river, then back again, as if something heavy was passing between me and the satellites. The radio stayed dead for the first 20 minutes, just a low hiss of static, until out of nowhere it snapped alive with that same high whistling tone, rising and falling like someone trying to imitate a siren with their mouth. Then beneath it, I heard Dana again, only this time her words were slow and stretched. "Do you see it, Evan?" Each syllable torn apart by the interference, and even though I pressed transmit and tried to answer, my own voice came back to me half a second late, thin and ghosted, like someone else was repeating everything I said a fraction of a beat behind me. By the time I reached the unmarked turnoff that led toward the cabins, the storm had eased into a steady, suffocating fall of snow, big flakes drifting straight down instead of sideways, and the aurora had pushed through the clouds in a solid band of greenish white that hung low over the treetops, bright enough that I cut my headlights and let the sky light the path. The Snowcat's treads crunched over the packed trail, and as I got closer, I saw a warm rectangle of light ahead where one of the cabin's windows shone yellow through the trees. Relief hit me first. Someone was inside, awake. Maybe they could help me get the patient into the Snowcat. But it lasted only a second, because as soon as I stepped out and pulled the door shut behind me, the cabin light flicked once, twice, and then cut off completely, plunging the clearing into a soft green half-dark, where the only illumination came from the aurora overhead and the glow leaking out of my own Snowcat's instrument panel. I called out, my voice sounding small between the trees. "Medical services. It's Evan from Kuskatak. I'm here to help." And the snow swallowed the words almost immediately. There was no wind now, no creak of branches, just the faint electric buzz from the sky and the crunch of my boots as I crossed the yard, passing an old snowmobile half buried in drifts, and a pair of moose antlers nailed over the door like a crude guardian. When I stepped up onto the tiny porch, I noticed the first thing that really bothered me. There were footprints everywhere around the cabin, big ones, small ones, some in bunny boots, some in regular winter boots, but they didn't make sense. They circled the cabin again and again, weaving between the trees and back to the door, overlapping so many times it looked like the snow had been chewed up by dozens of people. Yet there was only one clear track that led away from the cabin into the forest, a single line of prints spaced far apart, toes digging deep as if whoever made them had been running hard. The door was slightly open, held by the latch so it couldn't swing all the way shut. When I pushed it inward with my gloved hand, the hinges squealed too loudly in the quiet, and a faint warmth breathed out along with the smell of coffee, kerosene, and something metallic, almost like pennies in your mouth. Inside, the cabin looked exactly like half the hunting shacks in Alaska. Plywood walls lined with hooks and parkas, a tiny wood stove in the corner glowing red, a table with a half-finished card game spread across it. But there was no one at the table, no one in the bunk, no one on the floor clutching some obvious wound. Only a thick patch of melted, refrozen ice near the center of the room, where snow had clearly been tracked in, melted by the stove and then frozen again when the door was left open too long. I called out again, louder. "It's Evan, EMS. If you can hear me, answer or knock on something." And only the stove answered, popping as a log shifted. My radio crackled at my hip, another burst of that whistling tone darting in and out of the static. But when I lifted it, the display showed no incoming call, no ID, just the empty channel number and a signal bar that jumped between full and zero like a heartbeat trying to flatline. There was a photo tacked to the wall by the stove, the kind people print out at home until the colors go a little wrong. A bearded man in his 50s, arms around a teenage girl, and a woman in a bright red parka, all three standing in front of the very same cabin in summer, with green trees and bare dirt instead of snow. And someone had written "First Season" at mile 42 in blue marker at the bottom, the ink blurred as though a wet thumb had smeared it. The only other door in the cabin led to a tiny storage area where canned food was stacked high against the walls, and at first, I thought that room was empty too, until I noticed the handheld radio sitting on top of a crate of beans, its antenna bent, its speaker grill clogged with a thin layer of rime. The little LED screen glowed faintly green, even though the power switch was in the off position. And as I leaned closer, I realized the radio wasn't silent. It was emitting an almost inaudible version of that same high, whistling tone, like someone playing a bottle in the next room. I backed out and shut the door on it, more to feel like I was doing something than because it would help. And that's when I saw the note under the magnet on the fridge, written in hurried block letters on the torn corner of a cardboard box. "If anyone comes, don't follow the lights. Don't answer the knocking. Don't let it ride home with you." And beneath that, in smaller handwriting that dug deep into the cardboard, the single word, "Please." The lights, I thought, and almost on cue a bright flare rolled across the ceiling as the aurora outside intensified, green bleeding into a strange purplish white that made the frost on the window panes glow. Through the glass I could see the snowcat parked where I left it, but there was something else now. A faint radiance in the tree line just beyond the clearing, flickering between the trunks like someone walking slowly with a lantern, pausing every few steps as if to see whether I was watching. My radio hissed again, then snapped into clarity so suddenly it made me flinch. This time the voice was unmistakably human, a woman's voice shaking with cold and fear. "If you're in my cabin, you need to leave right now. This isn't a joke. It knows you're there." And though there was no ID number, I knew it was the woman from the photograph, the one in the red parka, because I could hear the same rough laugh lines in her words that were etched around her mouth in the picture. I pressed transmit and said, "Ma'am, this is Evan from Kuskataki MS. I'm here to help. Are you injured? Where are you?" But there was a long delay, a soft rush of static, and then she answered in that same terrified whisper, "It can't cross moving water on its own. That's why it stays in the lights. It rides them like a bridge. We made the mistake of watching it from the river once. Thought it was pretty. Thought we were lucky. You need to get back to town before the wind picks up or it'll drop down on you and you won't even know until you hear it knock on the roof." I wanted to ask 100 questions, but another sound cut through the cabin. A dull, deliberate thump from directly above me, as though someone had just dropped a heavy bag of sand onto the roof. Dust sifted down from the seam where the boards met, and the stove flickered as if a gust had hit it, though the air in the room remained absolutely still. The woman on the radio started sobbing then, small, desperate sounds pushed through gritted teeth. "It heard me. I shouldn't have talked. It's going to look for me again. Don't let it see your face when you go outside. Don't look straight up. That's how it remembers you. That's how it knows who to follow." And then the transmission dissolved into screeching static that rose in pitch until my whole head rang with it, forcing me to rip the radio from my ear and thumb the volume down. The thumping came again, moving this time, shifting from the center of the roof toward the far wall where the window was. Heavy footstep-like impacts that made the cups on the table rattle. A shadow passed over the frosted glass, blotting out the green glow for a second. But its outline didn't look like any person or animal I knew. More like a tangle of limbs and antlers pressed together, sliding slowly along the outside wall. I've been scared plenty of times on calls, but there's a special kind of fear that comes when you realize you've crossed from the world where problems can be solved with training and tools into a place where the rules don't help you anymore, and standing in that cabin with the radio buzzing in my hand and something walking around on the roof. I knew I wasn't going to save anyone out here. The best I could do was keep whatever this was from coming back with me. The note on the fridge echoed in my head. Don't follow the lights, don't answer the knocking, don't let it ride home with you. And I made my decision fast, because fear only gets worse if you give it time. I grabbed a marker from the table, scribbled on the back of the note my name and the time I'd arrived, then added, "No patient found, leaving area." Mostly so that if someone ever did come back, they'd know I didn't just vanish. Then I stepped out onto the porch without giving myself the chance to hesitate. I kept my eyes down, like she'd said, staring at the churned-up snow instead of the aurora that flared so bright now it painted the drifts with moving patterns. And something in that light felt almost thick, like it had weight. I could sense it pressing on my shoulders, nudging at the back of my head, urging me to tilt my chin up and look at the sky the way any sane human would when it's burning overhead like liquid fire. But I forced myself to focus on the dark rectangle of the snowcat and the small pool of shadow beneath it where my boots would go. Behind me, on the roof, the footsteps followed, pacing along the ridge as I crossed the yard. They stayed directly above me the whole time, matching my speed, never faster, never slower, just a constant heavy presence that made the boards groan. And once, just once, I heard a soft brushing sound near my ear, like long fingers trailing through my hood as something tried to reach down without quite crossing whatever boundary still held it. The moment I climbed into the snowcat and slammed the door, the sound stopped. The roof went silent, the footsteps cut off, and although the aurora still blazed outside, the pressure on my skull eased, as if there were an invisible dome over the cab that it couldn't quite penetrate. I drove back to town with the heater on full blast and the radio turned all the way down, refusing to answer even when it crackled with my name in voices that were almost but not quite familiar. Dana, the dispatcher, my father, my own voice asking where I'd gone. And I didn't look in the rear-view mirror even once because every time I glanced toward it, the glass seemed too dark, too deep, as if it were reflecting a sky that wasn't really there. The official report says I responded to a false alarm that night. No patient found, likely an accidental call or a broken line. The phone company checked the number and said the cabin's landline had been disconnected 2 weeks earlier, and nobody has seen the family from the photograph in town since the start of the season, though their names still sit on the mail shelf at the post office. I told myself for months that I'd been tired, stressed, maybe even half dreaming out there in the storm, until the first thaw came and the river started to move again, cracking its winter shell and rolling chunks of ice down toward the sea. And one night, as the breakup roared outside my window and the northern lights spread in a curtain over the moving water, I heard a slow, polite knocking on the roof above my bed, 3 measured blows that sent dust trickling down onto my pillow. When I reached for the radio on my nightstand, its LED screen was already glowing faint green, though I hadn't turned it on, and from the speaker, I heard that same high, whistling tone rise and fall like distant laughter riding the Bridge of Light in from mile 42. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your night with us. If these stories gave you chills, there's plenty more waiting. Don't forget to subscribe to NightFear Stories for new terrifying tales every single night. Sleep well, if you can.